Welcome to another Trench Chat, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Roger Steward, who works as a battlefield guide in Flanders, and he is the author of two superb books on the Great War, one about the German cemetery at Langemarck, and a new one that's just come out, Reclaiming the Salient, Resurrecting the Great War Battlegrounds of Flanders Fields, published just recently by Helion. So welcome to the podcast, Roger.
Hi, Paul. And thank you very much for inviting me on such a podcast with such a great reputation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So, I mean, you work as a battlefield guide in Flanders. How's your journey brought you there?
Oh, it's quite a long story, really. Originally, my wife is from this area. So we moved to the area all around about 2010, and we opened a bed and breakfast in Ypres. And then I've always had a passion for the First World War, going right back till I was about 10 years old. And I can trace that right back as well. I don't know if you remember, Paul, but growing up, I mean, I'm 55, so growing up in the UK in the 1970s, all the kids' comics were kind of World War II based stuff, you know, like Warlord and whatever. But there was one in particular called Battle Action, and it brought out a comic strip called Charlie's War. And it was for the first time I'd heard anything about the First World War. And the artwork, in effect, was very graphic in terms of, you know, the mud and the horror of the trenches and the rats and everything else. So that really got me hooked on the First World War from an early age. Then I read All Quiet on the Western Front at quite an early age as well. And from then on, really it's been kind of a passion for me throughout the rest of my life. And it was fate, really. I suppose I met my wife. She was from this area. We opened a B&B, which we sold in 2015 because my wife was offered a job back in design, which is her real passion. But by then I'd started to offer tours, from the B&B and working for different companies in town. But now I work purely for myself. I run my own battlefield tour company.
Fantastic. I mean, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Charlie's War. It had a massive influence on me. You know, I'm a kind of same generation as you. And that kind of comic strip that really brought those stories of the First World War alive, a hugely kind of influential thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm busy collecting them again now because they've released them all in hardback form. So I'm trying to get copies. I think there's about 10 volumes. So I haven't read any yet, reread any yet. I'm not too sure if I want to be honest, because, you know, growing older now, will that shatter my illusions of it? I don't know. But at the time, great, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I have some of the reprints, and I still have a few of my original copies of the comic actually, because there was two that I kept, which is the story when Charlie's pushing this lad down the Menin Road, and I think it ends with a shell burst, and the lad survives, and he's not sure whether Charlie survives, and he then comes back in the 1980s on a battlefield tour, and that kind of part of it is this veteran returning to visit the brooding soldier and the main square at Ypres and the Menin Gate. And when that came out, you know, I was about 16, I think, and I was still reading it, and I photocopied and sent it to John Giles, who was the founder of the Western Front Association, and he thought it was extraordinary that this was, you know, in his words, hopefully breeding a new generation of battlefield historians, and here we are.
Yeah, but it's important, you know, because, you know, even today, when you look at, you know, all the films which have been released recently, you know, 1917, All Quiet on the Western Front, I don't know, some of them aren't true to the existing book or whatever. But from my opinion, it doesn't matter. You know, if it gets one person involved or interested in the First World War, then, you know, it's done its job. So there's a lot of good stuff being released, you know, literature-wise and film-wise at the moment as well, which is fantastic.
And your work as a guide, you know, traveling around the battlefields on a regular basis as you do, you'll have heard all kinds of stories, not all of them entirely accurate, which I guess is what kind of led you to write your book on Langemarck.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As you say, you know, being a guide here and being lucky enough to live here as well, you know, we get a lot of clients from, you know, the local bed and breakfasts and whatever. And what you have to remember also here is the local population here, you know, have suffered in effect two German occupations, you know, in certain areas of Belgium, World War One, and of course all of Belgium in World War Two. And so over the years, a lot of myths sprang up about Langemarck Cemetery to the point where it kind of became pseudo fact. The reason being is there was nothing really for anybody else to refer back to in terms of research. And you can imagine writing about a German cemetery in Belgium in the 1950s and 60s probably wasn't the most fashionable thing to be doing. And of course, there's also, to be quite honest, a motivation of people here, in effect, of a dislike of all things German, particularly during that era, and that's kind of been handed down, to some of the generations. So quite often on tours, we tell people, right, we're on our way to Langemarck Cemetery now, and someone would say from the back of the minibus, "Oh yeah, our bed and breakfast owner tells us this is where they're all buried standing up." And of course, they're not. Or another favourite was, which I told the German Wargrave Commission this one, and they were just open mouthed. One of the myths is the crosses were all black, okay, because we told the Germans they had to have black crosses because it's the colour of evil, okay. And I told the German Wargrave Commission this, and they were like, "You can't be serious." They said the only reason the crosses are black is because of the wood preservative we use, the creosote. Just changes the wood black, simple as that. So that was kind of the reasons why I wrote the book, really, because you could hear these stories become pseudo facts, and sometimes you would hear teachers telling their groups this as well. And I'm not a rude person; I wouldn't go up to another guide and say, "Well, that's incorrect." So that's the reason I wanted to write the book, to do or produce a balanced history of the book without bias, telling the story of the cemetery from start to finish up to the modern day. Do a guided tour of the cemetery as well, and then a third section at the back of the book, dispelling some of these myths. So yeah, that's the main driver behind me writing the Langemarck book.
And it is an excellent book. I mean, I've recommended it on the podcast before, but it's not often you can say that a book comes along and genuinely tells new stories of the First World War, and that one most certainly does. So it's all credit to you.
Thank you. And do you know what's been nice for me as well, as an independent guide here? What's been really nice for me is for guys like yourselves, well-established guides have come up to me in the cemetery or wherever they've come across me and have said, "Thank you for writing the book. It's changed how we guide in the cemetery." So for me, that gives me a great deal of pleasure, to know that that has changed certain things in the way people do things.
And not only have you done that with Langemarck with your new book, which is looking at that really fascinating kind of post-war period, interwar period between the end of the Great War and the beginning maybe of the next Great War.
Yeah.
It's another absolutely fascinating, compelling book, Roger.
Thank you.
And a kind of essential theme with, I guess, Reclaiming the Salient is the iron harvest, which we kind of think we all know. You can bring in a lot more kind of information to that, really.
Yeah, for me also, I mean, again, this kind of stems back to my, to my daily tour business. The two subjects which seem to grab people's attention the most is the iron harvest and, of course, body recoveries here, during the present day as well. And living here as well, I always remember when I first moved here, you're fascinated by the stuff. There's artillery shells and hand grenades and stuff laying by the sides of the roads, outside the entrances to farmers, courtyards or whatever, and you spend all your time pulling over and taking photographs, and you kind of have to take a step backwards and remember what they're manufactured for. They're manufactured to kill people. These things are over 100 years old now. Very unstable in a lot of cases, which means, as you'll see in the book, there's been lots of accidents here over the years, including fatalities, some of it accidental, some of it caused by, people basically doing things with these shells which they shouldn't really be doing, tampering with the shells. But the real thing is, the DOVO, who are the Belgian bomb disposal units, they still recover here every single year on average around about 250 tons a year of unexploded ordnance from the First World War. And the shocking thing with that is not decreasing as the years go by. If anything, it increases. So the DOVO kind of, I think I mentioned in the book, I think there's around about 10 million, they estimate about 10 million shells left to be recovered, which means they'll be finding shells long after we're all dead and gone, quite frankly.
Yeah, the statistics are absolutely staggering when you kind of look at it, and you describe it in your book. And it's what's interesting as well is that kind of post-war period. It seems that, rather than just blow everything up, they buried a hell of a lot of stuff.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. And you've also got during that period as well, during the German retreat in 1918, they're burying caches of arms booby trapping caches of arms as well. So it's not all about sometimes, individual shells that farmers dig up. Sometimes they'll find caches of shells. I think they did in, was it 2018, around the Passchendaele area. They found well over 200 shells there. And unusually for the Dovo and for the Belgians, they actually shut the area off. I mean, you as a guide yourself, Paul, will know they normally just left by the side of the road and eventually they'll be picked up. But this was such a serious find that, they shut the whole area off. A high proportion of those, of course, were mustard gas shells as well, which is still viable today. So if you're ever touring the area and you see an artillery shell by the side of the road with a horrible black oily liquid bubbling out of the case, leave it well alone.
Start running.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about how kind of tourists are very relaxed about this. Like people have kind of touristy photos taken around with them kind of standing by shells or even sitting on shells.
Yeah. I mean, well, funny enough, when I also remember when myself and my wife ran the bed and breakfast, I remember it vividly. We went into a guy's room and he was staying with his son. And we went into his room to clean his room, and he'd been out for the day and they'd gone out again. And sitting on the mantelpiece, or on the windowsill, of his room was an 8-inch shell. And this massive artillery shell he'd found, picked up, put it in the back of his car, took it into the bed and breakfast, and was going to try and get it across the channel. Unbelievable. So we explained to him, this is very dangerous, you can't be doing this. And eventually we got the bomb disposal out to come and take it. But there's a complete lack of, how can I put this? Not respect is so much, but education, I suppose. It's probably because, back at home in the UK, anything like that would be roped off for miles. But here you see it by the sides of the road, so I presume people just think it's safe. But of course, it's anything but that.
And it's a curiosity that goes back to those kind of early days. You mentioned an incident in the book with a war graves gardener who takes a lady out onto the battlefields.
Yeah. William Curtis. Yeah. That was an interesting one, actually, because I came across his name in the Flanders Fields names list, which lists people who had been, killed by the Iron Harvest since the end of the First World War. And I looked through the War Graves Commission's records and could find kind of no record of him. So I thought the easiest way to try and track this guy down is to look in Ypres Cemetery, where the War Graves Commission graves are. But he was down on the records as William Cuatis. So by doing some research, we actually got his name re-registered on the system, if you will, correctly. But yeah, his story was basically I think he was in a cemetery. It looks like he was with another lady who was probably a tourist in the area because she was booked into lodgings in Ypres at the time. Whether she was showing him something or he picked up a grenade or a shell or whatever to show her, but it basically went off, killed him, and injured the lady in question as well. So War Graves Commission gardeners have quite a dangerous job sometimes as well. I remember a guy telling me once, actually, over at Ypres Reservoir Cemetery, they found a hand grenade in the compost there because they were just digging the compost and they popped a Mills bomb, which is kind of not unusual here.
Yeah, I mean, many of the cemeteries are literally on battlefields, aren't they? So
absolutely, yeah,
probably not surprising. Yeah, not surprising at all. And that kind of legacy of munitions, as you've said, is something that carries on to this day. The work of Dovo, who are the Belgian unit that deals with this, is never ending.
Yeah, and I have to give these guys 100% credit for the work they do. First of all, from my point of view, in terms of contacting them, they were so open in terms of helping me with research. I had 2 days out with the Dovo as well. They invited me to their depot where they diffuse all the chemical weapons and went through all the procedures with that. And I also had a day out with the guys who drive around and collect the munitions. But I was driving at a kind of safe distance, behind them, if you see what I mean. And it's incredible. They basically go around with a flatbed lorry with a sand pit in the back. When they get to a site, they assess the shell to see whether they think it's high explosive or chemical, and also to assess if there's any immediate danger. And then when they think it's reasonably safe, they will physically pick it up, put it into the sand pit in the back of the van until it's full, and then they'll take it back to the depot. On arrival at the depot, there's a guy, would you believe, and this is the only bit which is a bit low tech, and this is the job I would not want, and this is the guy who has a hammer, and he gently chips the mud and the rust off the shell to see what type of shell it is. Okay.
Gosh.
Yeah. And then what they do, they then X-ray it. So when they X-ray the shell, they can then tell easily if it's high explosives or if it contains chemical or a liquid or whatever, and then they dispose of it accordingly. Fascinating place, though.
And is it right they have a kind of special device to dispose of the gas shells?
Yeah, they've got two devices actually, and it depends on the type of gas shell, but basically they're massive self-contained containers. And what they'll do, they'll superheat the shells, which then makes the burster charge within the shell blow. It shatters the shell in effect, releases the gas, but the heat inside the chamber is so much or so great, it instantly destroys the gas. The air then goes through a filtration system, and then of course when it's clean, then it's released, and then the rest of the shell then is disposed of. So it's a completely safe procedure. There have been accidents over the years, of course, not with that equipment, but when the equipment was a lot more basic than that. But it's real state-of-the-art technology there.
And I guess that's not a quick process to diffuse a gas shell like that.
No, from start to finish, it has to go through the process, of course, of being collected, then being identified. They can only dispose of X amount at any one time. And of course, the amount they're collecting sometimes, outruns the time they've got to diffuse it, if you see what I mean. They're collecting more than the time allows to diffuse. And particularly in the winter months as well, if they're high explosive shells, because what they do with the high explosive shells, they blow them up twice a day, close to the forest where they are. So they dig these really deep pits, put a crate of high explosive shells into the pit with an anti-tank mine on top, cover it over with earth, and then blow the things up. But they can only do it for so many months a year, because in the winter months, the explosions make the ground unstable in the area, and they can affect the foundations of the local buildings. So there's so many months a year when they can't dispose of things as well. So it then starts to accrue at the depot. And then, of course, they carry on back in the spring when they can.
So just as they're getting that big pile of munitions down, it builds back up again as soon as the farmers work. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it just seems to be a never-ending process. I mean, as a guide yourself, Paul, you'll know that you drive around the area, and if you stay on a particular route, you kind of get to know where the local farmers leave their unexploded ordnance, where they find it. And there's a particular farm just past the Brooding Soldier, where you turn left and where the big greenhouses are there. There's a farm there on the left-hand side, and he always has stuff outside the front of his gate set. So you'll often drive past there, there'll be half a dozen shells there, but after a week, they'll be gone. The Dovo would have collected them. A couple of days later, he's ploughed up more, because you're very close, as you know, to the Passchendaele Ridge there. So it just keeps going and going and going. Yeah.
And there have been some crazy people who kind of collect this live stuff as well.
It's true. One of the problems, and this is one of the reasons why there's been fatalities here, I kind of alluded to it earlier, is people kind of abuse these things. There's a big market here for collectors for some of these shells, for two things. First of all, if it's an unusually large shell, the collectors like to take these things away, diffuse them, and then sell them as empty shells to other collectors. But also, the British shells in particular have got a brass fuse. And if you can get the fuse off and shine it up, it makes a nice paperweight, and you'll see them, for sale in the shops in town and whatever. But the problem, of course, is after over 100 years in the ground, the fuses don't unscrew anymore. They're kind of rusted on. So you'll read stories here of collectors have been killed in the past by hitting fuses with hammers to try and release them, cutting them off with angle grinders, sparks and explosives, trying to release these things. So there are genuine accidents here, but a lot of the accidents here are caused by, people just doing crazy things. And the problem is, probably 99% of these things will never go off because they're faulty and they haven't gone off, in the first place. But there's that small percentage which will, and you can never tell by looking at them. So eventually, some people's luck runs out. But an example of an accidental incident was last year, where a Belgian farmer's wife picked up from a field what she thought was a potato, and it turned out to be a Mills bomb. So the Mills bombs are British hand grenades. When they come out of the ground, look like potatoes because they're covered in clay. Now, she picked this thing up. Luckily for her, it only partially detonated. So it damaged her hand. It peppered her face with shrapnel. I believe she must have been wearing glasses because her eyes were okay. Had that gone off properly, it would have killed her. So she was quite lucky.
I think that story even made the British press, I seem to remember.
Yeah, I think it probably did. Yeah. Have you heard the story about the Smith's crisp factory in Hong Kong a few years
No,
ago?
no.
Okay, there was a Smith's crisp factory in Hong Kong, and the same thing happened actually. There was an explosion on the line. It had shut the line down. Luckily, didn't injure anybody, but they traced the potatoes back to the Somme region in France. So amongst the potatoes was a hand grenade.
Good grief. Good
Hmm.
grief. So with the Dovo as well, I mean, these are kind of accidents with crazy people trying to defuse munitions and then things that go off on conveyor belts or whatever. But Dovo have suffered casualties as well, I believe.
Yeah, the Dover have over the years, right from the start, of course, and the last major accident, was in the 1980s. At the end of the day, it's a very, very dangerous job these guys do, and they're aware of the risks, and they try and minimise the risks as best they can. But there's always going to be that element of risk there as well, which they can't negate. So, unfortunately, from time to time, there are accidents. But luckily, there hasn't been a major one since the 1980s.
And with the kind of clearance of the battlefields after the war, obviously the munitions and the material of war is kind of one level of it. But there was also the dead that, were everywhere in Flanders fields.
Yeah, yeah. And for me, that's been probably out of the two subjects, that's been the one which has kind of opened my eyes a lot to some of the facts which were going on here post World War One. I mentioned in the book really that the British Army gave up looking for the dead, and that there was a good 300,000 unrecovered bodies still on the Western Front, and there was discussions going on where they were worried about if the public finds out about this, there's going to be is there going to be problems at home with regards to PR and that kind of thing. And there's, I mentioned in the book as well, when the British Army finally stops looking for the dead and kind of hands over part responsibility to the IWGC at the time, there were still bodies laying here above ground. You have officers, writing reports saying, oh, there's a body on the Langemarck Road by a bunker here, and basically given lists of where bodies were left. So it's an interesting point in terms of that, because I also make the point in the book as well. When you look at the clearance teams, the Labour Company teams who are clearing the dead, these guys were specialists. They'd really created their own set of rules and regulations on how to recover bodies and identify them and rebury them. And of course, when these guys go, that element of specialisation, if you will, had gone. And so I make the point in the book, had they stayed on for another few years, how many extra soldiers' bodies would have been recovered, and not only recovered, maybe successfully identified. But, we'll never know.
And the task of recovery was massive, wasn't it? Because there were, we visit Flanders now and we still see cemeteries everywhere, but there were even more in 1918.
Yeah. Not only was it a massive task, it was a deeply unpleasant task as well, as you can imagine. And also, as the time went on, the army is demobilizing as quickly as it can. So you got this situation of less and less men involved in body recoveries. So it becomes a more difficult task. But I can't imagine what that task must have been like for those guys in the early days. Because you have to remember, a period in time, it's 1919, 1920. They're doing visual checks of the battlefield. They're looking for evidence of graves. I mean, some of it was quite obvious. You might have an upturned rifle stuck in the ground, with a helmet on, for example, or a shallow grave. But also they're looking for clues to where bodies were. For example, a shell hole. If the water had turned black, they know there's a body down there. Rat holes in the battlefield. Rats were digging down to get to the bodies, bringing up bits of bone, bits of equipment, so they know then there's a body down there. Depressions in the ground where a grave had maybe settled. Even the grass would change colour where a body's buried. And of course, in the early days, you're still dealing with putrid remains. So one of the pieces of equipment, the Labour Company teams had, was basically a machine gun rod, long thin piece of metal. And if they believed there was a body, concealed, they would push the metal down into the ground. You could feel then if there's a cavity in the ground as well. That would give an indication if a body was down there. And unfortunately, also what they would do is they would pull the rod out of the ground and smell the end. Yeah, if it stank, then there's a body down there. So it's a very grim task. And of course, once they recover the body, part of the job then is to go through the pockets of the remains, look for any identification, look for the guy's dog tag. You know, the force of the explosion that killed the man quite often had driven the dog tags into his body itself. So they're rummaging around this guy's remains to get, you know, to find any identification. So it must have been a harrowing task for those men.
A really unpleasant one. Yeah, there's a picture in your book where there's a group of them exhuming a body from a kind of slightly flooded bit of ground, levering it out with a shovel, and one of them's looking back towards the camera, probably kind of revolting at the smell of it, and it captures that moment. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah, yeah, and you can only imagine. I mean, some of these guys also, but at the time, they're actually living on the battlefield. They're sleeping on the battlefield in tents. You know, I mentioned a quote from Stephen Graham's book in there, and he asked them, you know, do they see any ghosts? And basically, they just kind of smile and laugh at him, and they say, "God, no, we see no ghosts here. These guys have seen, you know, the worst of the worst." But you can imagine, I would suggest some of these guys were drinking quite heavily as well, you know, just to try and, you know, take their mind off the task as well, I would suggest.
Yeah, because it wasn't just one body they were removing every day. It was potentially hundreds, wasn't it?
Yeah, so, you know, yeah. And the body density maps, which were produced at the time, were split down into 500-yard squares. And you will see, if you ever see a body density map, normally written in blue pen, is the amount of bodies they expected to recover in that square. So what they would do before they searched the battlefield, they would survey the battlefield. They would go around. They would physically look for bodies or where they think bodies were. They would put a stake down, okay, mark those positions, and then that information would then be transferred onto the body density map. So they knew, for example, they expect to find 120 bodies, for example, in one square, because that's what they've found, or what they believe they've found. Quite often they would find more as they're looking for one, then of course they would find more. But the body density maps are quite interesting because, for example, if you ever look at one for the Passchendaele area, for example, there's a square there up near the Bruisende Ridge, and in about a 500-yard square, there's something ridiculous like 500 bodies. And a lot of people would say, oh, you know, maybe that was part of the attack, a machine gun position or whatever. Actually, it's part of an old cemetery. So that's why you've got, or the formation of the First World War battlefield cemetery, that's why you've got that concentration of bodies there. So there's stories behind, you know, all these facts and figures.
And it wasn't kind of a random search. It was all kind of organised. And you talk a lot about the man who was essentially kind of the architect of commemoration, which is Fabian Ware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Fabian Ware, I mean, for the job really which Fabian Ware did, you know, during the First World War, from his early days, you know, he knew pretty much because of his age, he's not going to be accepted as, you know, as a regular soldier. So he volunteers to come to the Western Front, you know, with the Red Cross. And he realizes very quickly, you know, there's nobody recording where these bodies are, where these graves are. So he starts to volunteer and set up his own system of registering bodies, which of course then the army takes on. And then eventually it all develops into, you know, the DWGC and then eventually into the War Graves Commission. So, you know, the whole of the country at that period and still today owes such a lot to that man.
And it was, you know, highly organised and they did amazing work. But one of the things that I discovered and found fascinating in your book was they didn't always get it right. There was this Hoog Crater inquiry.
Yeah, no, the Hooger Crater inquiry is a really interesting one because it all comes about really because of an Australian officer in the area who was head of the Australian body recovery teams. And he wanted two Australian graves to be investigated in Hooger because they'd already been replicated. He found that the same bodies or the same names were on other headstones. So they exhumed the graves and found them to be incorrect. So then they started to exhume more and they found more and more discrepancies. And it was really because of that. The reason being is it's like everything else in the First World War. You know, even when you go back to talk about the generals and everything else, you know, these guys are learning as they go. This is the first war of its kind. And even down to body recoveries and reburials, they've never had to do this on the scale of this before. So Captain Crawford, who was head of his Labour company at that time, he was in charge of those burials at Hooger, and there was a big inquiry, as you'll read in the book, with regards to this. But it's also Captain Crawford who lays down the first set of rules and regulations in terms of how to recover bodies, quite strict rules and regulations in terms of this, and that changes in effect the way everybody else works. So when you look at that inquiry, but the inquiry itself is quite interesting because they're not trying to attribute blame to anybody. They're just trying to find out what had happened. And of course, you do have another Labour company investigating this. And so there's always that element as well of one Labour company want to look better than another Labour company trying to prove the other one wrong. So when you kind of read about the inquiry, but some of that comes through as well. But it's very interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of mistakes, inaccuracies made at the time, which is understandable when you look at the scale of it.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember kind of reading about some of the graves that they concentrated and isolated graves that when they went to exhume, they couldn't find anything.
Yeah, yeah. And in Hooger, for example, they found a German body, underneath supposedly a British grave. Yeah, and that's not unusual. Sometimes, as I said at Hooger as well, bodies laying across different graves. So yeah, so it's not unusual that they'd open graves up, for example, and find nobody there.
And of course, that brings us on to another thing that I absolutely found fascinating in your book, was this whole thing about bringing bodies home that people, when the war ended, wanted to repatriate and couldn't, but some people then tried to circumvent that.
Yeah, do you know, that was a fascinating subject to research. This idea or this thing about illegal repatriations or body snatching, because as early as 1914, the British Army's putting in place this idea of no repatriation because they realised quite quickly in the early days of the war, anybody who was repatriating bodies were wealthy families, and that was seen to be grossly unfair. So during the First World War itself, the army was able to hide behind Belgian legislation, which makes it illegal to remove a body which is already buried without good reason. But of course, that was the theme, if you will, or the story told to the British public at the time. So when the war finishes, the British public, in a lot of cases, are expecting that regulation to be lifted. But then, of course, it's not, and it's made permanent. The fact there's going to be no repatriation. Now, for some families, particularly some wealthy families, these guys wouldn't accept this as an answer. And there was a huge uproar in the UK about it. And it even involves the royal family. Because, as you know, buried on the outskirts of, or just on the outskirts of Ypres, in Ypres, in the main cemetery here, is Prince Maurice of Battenberg. Okay, so Queen Victoria's grandson, the only member of the royal family to be killed in the First World War. And of course, the royal family want his body brought back. So Sir Fabian Ware, I mean, we mentioned him earlier, but imagine standing up. How brave is this? Standing up to the royal family at that point in history and saying, no, you can't bring him back because all the other mothers in the country, they can't bring their sons back as well. So there's this huge outcry at the time from the royal family. And it gets to the point eventually where the royal family's advisors have to say to the royal family, just calm down a bit because you're going to start to lose public opinion on this. So then the royal family wanted Prince Maurice to have a big grand headstone in effect. And again, that was turned down. He has to have the same grave as everybody else. So the royal family eventually adhered to this, okay? But for some other families, they, for whatever reason, grief, or because they just weren't used to accepting regulations or they didn't think were applicable to them, whatever, but they took it a step further, which is basically hiring local individuals, will say, to remove the bodies at night. Now, it doesn't go on a lot, but it does go on. And there are some successful repatriations as well. A lot of them were caught. For example, Private Hopkins, who was buried in Tynecott Cemetery, his father, who was the mayor of Saskatchewan at the time, tried to remove his remains, but they caught him at Antwerp, and they reburied Private Hopkins in the British cemetery near Antwerp. But there's a famous case of a Canadian officer with the surname of Jury, and his mother actually got him repatriated back. There was a huge argument going on, and lots of letters going on between her family and the War Graves Commission at the time. I want my son back. No, you can't. And it's going backwards and forwards. Then it all stops. And then the War Graves Commission, it comes to light, a newspaper cutting, I think from the Toronto Star, if I remember rightly, saying that he's about or has just been buried in Toronto Cemetery. So the War Graves Commission go to the cemetery. It's in France on the Somme, open his grave up, and his remains are gone. but not all of his remains. So in the dead of night, okay, under cover of darkness, they've removed pretty much all of his remains. They've left a few bits behind, put what they can into a suitcase, basically, and sent it over to Canada.
Wow.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah.
You call it the business of death, which I think is a fantastic kind of phrase for it. And I guess this was a generation that was only one removed from people robbing cemeteries in London for medical students, that
Yeah,
kind
absolutely.
of,
Yeah.
that idea.
Yeah. And do you know what was really interesting, which again I mentioned in the book, was it surfaced in one of the Walgraves Commission's meetings at the time. Sir Fabian Ware was worried, scared about organised crime. And his fear was basically people coming over here, and he says we've got the sons of lots of wealthy people buried here, lots of influential people, even the royal family, as I mentioned, and they're worried about body snatching and those bodies being held to ransom. So they're trying to suppress the whole thing. They don't want it to become, known. They don't want to encourage it, in effect, or give anybody the wrong idea.
Absolutely, and I kind of think that's crime in some respects associated with death, particularly on the scale of the First World War, is something that we don't know enough about. I remember reading that confidence strictures used to go into libraries in the interwar period and look up local casualties, and then go and knock on the door and say, "I knew your Billy in the trenches," and he said, "If I ever needed whatever, and that you would give it to me." And even worse were the missing ones, where they'd tell them that they knew what had happened to their son, and if they didn't give them this or that, then they wouldn't tell them.
Yeah, well, apparently there was an ex-British officer involved. Colston is his name, and they think he was operating out of Poppering. He had his own battlefield bureau, his own battlefield group, tour guide business at the time. They think he was operating out of Popperinger with some local guys from Popperinger. What they were doing is they were hanging around cemeteries looking for wealthy-looking individuals, looking at graves, and then going over to them and offering their services. I can get your son brought home for X amount of money if you keep it quiet, kind of thing. So they were physically approaching people in the cemeteries.
And that kind of leads us on. I mean, the kind of interwar period we could probably talk about for hours, but you do move on to the Second World War, and then how that then affects the area. And on the podcast, we've often talked about how World War One meets World War Two, and the whole kind of process starts all over again.
Yeah, absolutely. And you still got, they're fighting on the same battlefields, Hill 60, for example. And it's quite interesting when you start to look at body recoveries by dates. You look at the body recoveries, 1939 and the early days of the Second World War in particular, they go up slightly in the area. Because what you've got British soldiers digging trenches again on the old battlefields, and they're digging up, the remains of soldiers from the previous war. So that goes on particularly over at Hill 60.
Extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
And with the fighting there as well, monuments and cemeteries ended up being damaged.
Yeah, and there's battlefield damage or battle damage over monuments here all over the place. Look at the fascia of the Menin Gate, for example, particularly the fascia facing away from the town. So if you come into the town, all the cement repair marks there, for example, most of that is caused by the British Army when they blow the bridge up to stop the Germans coming through during the Second World War. And the dark cement repair marks on the rear columns around the panel where the New Zealand plaque is, that's German machine gun fire from World War II. There's shrapnel damage underneath the window frames along the road of the Meningstraat there as you go into town. There's damage over headstones in Essex Farm, for example, all down to fighting in World War II. You've got the QVR, Queen Victoria Rifles Memorial, blown up over at Hill 60. That's collateral damage again during World War II. So there's evidence of both wars here, all over the place. Once you know what you're looking for.
And it kind of shows that the history of the battlefields beyond the armistice was an ever evolving thing, and you bring it up to date with looking at battlefield archaeology in Flanders.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic thing now, because what the Belgians have done, in particular, if you look at it in terms of body recoveries, they're very different to how the French authorities recover bodies. So what the Belgian authorities did a few years ago was, if a body is discovered, they then make it temporarily property of the Belgian state, okay, which means they can then bring in proper archaeologists, and they give the archaeologists 48 hours to remove the body from the site. which means you start to get more reports of body recoveries because you haven't got builders anymore worrying they're going to be shut down for 3 weeks or whatever. So people are reporting bodies. And what we do, the archaeologists come in, they'll remove the set of remains. They will also search the area for any other ways of identifying those remains. They will produce a report and then release that report off to the War Graves Commission and the JCCC back home in the UK, and eventually the body will be released to the British authorities. So in terms of the archaeology, that's helped immensely in terms of the control, we'll say, of how the dead are recovered, but also in terms of preserving the battlefields as well. It's an ongoing thing here. There's always archaeological digs going on here, because you have to remember there was trenches here everywhere, and they're all still here, but just filled in after the war. So if you dig in the right field in the right place and you dig deep enough, you're going to find the floors to the trenches and the side supports, which is what happened at Yorkshire Trench, for example. And once they find that, they can then trace the route of the trenches. So the archaeological work here is ongoing, and it's very important in terms of preservation for the battlefield as well.
And now, as you say, it's all kind of organised, you know, a bit like it was when the battlefields were properly cleared after the war. But when that ended, there was this big gap before the dead were recovered again on any kind of scale. I remember Andre Becker at Krunart going out with a detector to find something, and often he'd find remains. But it was the diggers, really, I think, that changed all of that with the recovery of that huge number of soldiers at Bösinger.
Yeah, and that's an incredible thing, because you also have to remember with the diggers as well. You know, these are part-time guys. These are Sunday afternoon guys. And they basically, when that site was being cleared for industrial use, you know, Yorkshire Trench over at Bösinger, when bodies started to turn up, which, you know, is not unusual here, but huge amounts of ammunition as well, these guys volunteered basically to try and stay one step ahead of the bulldozers, to try and recover as many bodies as they could. Now, eventually, they recovered, I think, the best part of 200 bodies. They could only identify one as an individual, Francois Metzinger, you know, the French soldier, because he had a metal ID tag. But the work these guys did was fantastic, because as a result of the work they did, 200 soldiers received proper burials. So it can't be underestimated or undervalued.
No, not at all, not at all. And I think that it kind of made that kind of archaeology respectable in that it, you know, Roman archaeology and medieval archaeology was what archaeologists who were professionals did, but
yeah,
a group of amateurs suddenly made professional archaeologists sit up and listen and take notice of this, which is great.
Yeah, and the thing also is what you have to remember, and it's still relevant today, is when they find a body today and they're able to identify him through DNA or whatever, he's going to have relatives still alive. So it's still, although it's 100 years ago and it's history, it's living history, you know, and it makes an impact on families today. No doubt, you know, you've been to burials in cemeteries where, you know, the families have been invited, and it's an emotional thing. You know, in a lot of cases, they've never met the guy involved, but his great-great-grandfather or whatever, they've done some research on him. He died at the age of 22 or whatever, you know. And it's a massive thing for the families. So at that point, that part of that archaeological work is extremely important.
Yeah, I think it shows that the power of the Great War is still so strong, you know, even beyond the centenary. People are moved by a relative that all they've got of them is a faded photograph.
Yeah, yeah. And for me, as a guide, I think for me that's probably the most satisfying part of what I do, is even today, because of the distances involved, you know, Australians and Canadians and New Zealanders, we will still get families come over today, and they're the first person to ever visit that grave. And it's a real honour to be able to take somebody to a graveside like that, and just to show them the grave and just walk away and say, right, I'm going to leave you now. This is kind of personal business for you guys. The emotion is just phenomenal. Honestly, makes the hair stand up on your arm. It's an incredible thing. Yeah,
it's a real privilege to be able to do, isn't it? Really,
absolutely. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And one of the things that I felt that when I was reading your book, that, you know, this is about the past, in some cases the recent past, but it felt very kind of prescient, really, because exactly the kind of things that they had to deal with after the Great War is going to be exactly the kind of things they're going to have to deal with after the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very. And there's a lot of similarities, aren't there, between the two wars. Not only the way they're fighting as well, but you kind of read stories of bodies laying out in fields everywhere and whatever. It must echo the Great War to a certain extent. Yeah, yeah.
And I guess it makes it feel as if this was something that will kind of never end, and that the story of the Great War and the pages of the history of the Great War will keep on turning.
Yeah, and as long as, in particular, I sometimes get asked the question, how long do you think this will last? Do you think people will always come? And I always often say to people here, if you think the Brits will stop coming, you don't understand the British psyche. Because whilst the cemeteries are here, we will always come. We will always remember. We will always visit these guys. And that's just going to carry on and on and on. And this is why it's so important that we get so many school groups come here, because these are the people of the future. These are the ones who are going to say to their kids, "Oh, I must take you to Tynecott Cemetery. I must take you to Langemarck Cemetery." And it's so important that these groups still keep coming and coming and coming, which they do still in large numbers, which is fantastic.
It is. And in terms of your own pages of Great War history, do you have another book in the pipeline?
Well, I have an idea, which I'm not going to kind of talk too much about, because I've still got to try and run it past a couple of publishers first. But I do have an idea, yeah. I would kind of like to do it on the same format as the book for Langemarck, in terms of like a mini guidebook type thing. So I'll come back to you on that one, Paul.
Brilliant. No, I'm pleased to hear that. Well, Roger, thanks so much for joining us. And your book, Reclaiming the Salient, is published by Helion & Co. We'll put links to it onto the podcast website so people can find that. And it's a fascinating read. Genuinely new stories and new research in there. So all credit to you for the work you've done there, mate.
That's really, really kind. And I appreciate your comments and thank you very much for that. I'd just like to say that I'm a very lucky person. I'm lucky enough to live here in an area I love and do a job. It's not a job. Do something I love. So yeah, I'm a really lucky person. So I can channel that into the books. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, I look forward to seeing you on the Old Front Line sometime soon.
Oh, no doubt you will. Thanks very much, Paul.
Thanks, Roger.
Yeah, keep well. Cheers.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.